It's my pleasure and honor to introduce our last keynote speaker for today and the last speaker for the India Harvard Conference, Mr. R. Gopalkrishnan. Mr. R. Gopalkrishnan is non-executive director at Tata Sons, the holding company of the $100 billion Tata Group. He's been a professional manager for more than 48 years, of which he spent the first 31 at Unilever and the last 17 at Tata Sons. He's a prolific speaker and a writer who is currently working on his fourth book. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Mr. R. Gopalkrishnan.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much to the organizers, and may I begin first by congratulating all those in the team. I'm the last speaker, so we don't have a chance to say thank you to you after this. This is a fantastic organization by the students. I was here last when my son was graduating, I think 2006 or 7, and he pleasantly surprised me by presenting me my future daughter-in-law. So I got 2 from Harvard, and reminded me that as an AMP alumnus, I don't quite qualify as a Harvard alumnus, but he would grudgingly allow me that status. So it's a nice pleasure to be here after 8 or 9 years. You know, when they asked me to speak and said keynote, I said, I don't know how many keys there are and how many notes there are, but how can you keep talking about India for 2 days without stopping? And I said, only Indians can do that. Other than the Congress party and the BJP, Chintak Beta, nobody else does it. So, everything that can be said about India has been said. GDP, politics, economics, society, change, cows, bulls. There's nothing else anybody can say. So I said, is it going to be the opening keynote or the closing keynote? And it's not until quite recently that I realized, I don't blame anybody else, I studied the papers and found that it's called the closing keynote. I said, I'm really had this time, because everybody would have spoken. I was told there are going to be 50 or 60 speakers at HBS, and yesterday at HKS there were probably another 60 speakers. To be the 121st speaker on India, you guys must get a prize for patience, and I must get a prize for courage. So I prepared 2 speeches. No PowerPoints, by the way, good news. One was if I was the opening speaker, and I've kept that away in my suitcase as I'm going to fly out tonight to Bombay. And the second is if I'm the last speaker. And I'm determined to tell you things that nobody has spoken of. 120 people haven't spoken about it. At least I think so. I haven't heard all the 120. So I'm going to try to meet this challenge of speaking for what they said, 20 minutes or so, and then keeping it open to questions, by giving you what I believe will not be unique or distinctive, but definitely a different take about India. And, you know, we will talk about GDP and so on in passing, but that's not the thrust of what I want to talk about. And there's a thematic unity in what I'm trying to say, and I would like to expose that thematic unity through a little story which all of you will recognize. Until about 150 years ago, people had babies at home in the US, in Europe, and definitely in India. It was not convenient, possible, and it's not a done thing to go to a nursing home or a hospital, whatever they were called. But in the early 1900s, there was a young couple who decided to have their baby in the hospital. And the baby was born in the hospital, and the name of the parents were Mr. and Mrs. Roger Button. And when Mr. Button wanted to get some information about the child who was born to his wife, people looked very scared. And he was wondering why until he cast his eyes on the baby. And I'm reading now from Scott Fitzgerald's book. What Mr. Button saw was wrapped in a voluminous white blanket and partly crammed into one of the cribs, there sat an old man. His sparse hair was almost white, and from his chin dripped a long smoke-colored beard. The child looked up at Mr. Button with dim, faded eyes in which there lurked a puzzled question. You all recognize which film this is. You all know the book. And the theme I want to present to you is that India is the Roger Button of the world. If countries could be treated as human beings, not the Roger Button, sorry, the Benjamin Button, that was the name of the child. India is a sort of a Benjamin Button. It's a child, it's an adult, it looks young and innocent, it looks old. We are a 20-year capitalist society, we are a 65-year-old democracy, but we are a 5,000-year-old civilization. And depends on which one you speak, people will remind you the other two. So if you say India produces no scientific papers, no research papers, we'll say, but we invented zero. Okay, that was a long time ago. And if you say we invented zero, they'll say, but what's been happening in the last 20 years? And therefore, I have decided to put a lens onto the country, which is the lens I, as a business person, I've been very lucky. I spent 30 years in Unilever, 31 years, and I've spent 17 years in Tata, and both are very wonderful companies. And I have to say one thing right up front, because I'm in a B school. I'm very proud I have a career in business. All this stuff that somebody did something excesses and somebody got greedy, okay, it happens everywhere. I'm not very proud of that. There's no society, there's no community, there is no nation, there is no company which is bereft of some greed and some of the foibles of wealth. But through a career in business, and now, as you can by now add it up, so I spent 48 years, I'm very proud that indirectly, through my work, I've had a honest, ethical education through which I have strived to deliver the benefits of my skills. Through two very wonderful organizations, I'm very lucky, I'm not doubting it. And I'd like to believe there's something about the way I thought about these careers that took me to these organizations. There must be some connection. And you benefited society in a dramatic way, in a very dramatic way, through the institution you served. What can one man do? Howsoever smart he is. So whether it is delivering hygiene into villages, through walking into the little villages of India which people don't know and to sell soap and teaching them how to use detergent, or through running trucks, or through giving people cell phones or steel. And it's not that I've done all of that, but the institutions I've worked for have done that. I don't see any reason why I should not feel proud of my business career. And the first thing I want all MBA students, because many of you are young people here, they keep asking me in the corridor, is you must feel very proud of what you do, because if you don't have the passion for what you do, then there's nothing to feel proud about. There's nothing to be apologetic about a business career just because a few guys have done something wrong. Every government officer, every politician is not corrupt, and is very proud to be an officer of the Indian Administrative Service or in Indian politics. Unfortunately, there are a few bad ones. So I want to root my Benjamin Button story through the eyes of a person who has traveled, and I've been very lucky, I think, other than Samoa Islands, I've probably been to many other places in the world. How did I, as a businessman, look at another country? And I would like to look at India from that point of view. When I used to go to Russia a lot in the 80s, pre-Glasnost, it was a very spooky place. And I wanted to know more about Russia, Poland, the Arab world, which I've traveled a lot. And I used to, with the limited foreign exchange that we had in our pocket in those days, buy lots of books. So my house has got a very rich library of books on the history, the economy, the politics. And to be honest, I have not been able to read all those books. And it's crazy to try to read all those books. So what was I interested as a businessman? I wanted a horizontal slice. I wanted to understand enough of the politics, enough of the economics, enough of the society to get on and do my business, to transact my business, because the ways and the cultures of doing business vary a lot across the world. And I thought of a foreigner interested in India, and I said, you start telling him about Aurangzeb and the Mughals and, Chanakya, and the guy says, oh my God, these are all lovely books, he'll take it back, and he'll be in exactly the same position. Can you give him a horizontal look about India? So that he can understand or begin to decipher the behavioral patterns that he sees in business. Why can't you shut up two Indians who are talking to you? Who can answer that question? It's not in any of the history books, right? Why are we such an argumentative society? Here, three Indians will have four opinions. By the way, I don't consider that to be a bad thing. I'm just saying it's a reality. Why does every Indian wait for the other guy? Barely has he finished, he's on to some other subject, He doesn't talk in sequence, as these funny Englishmen and Americans do, They wait for each to finish and they try to have a conversation. And so what I did is I broke up some headlines into three categories. And I want to show you something which is truly distinctive about India, which is why I call it Benjamin Button, about its political evolution, about its economic evolution, and above all, its cultural evolution. And I propose to just touch upon one or two aspects, because it's not a thesis that I'm going to deliver here. Anyway, Harvard won't give me a PhD for this, so it's okay. And tell you some things that you probably know, but you have not strung them into that story. So let me first talk about the political evolution. I don't want to go back 5,000 years if I can help it. But if you look at any country in the world, they followed a sequence. I mean, they were all dukes and monarchies until 1600, 1700. And the first thing that was unleashed was capitalism through the Industrial Revolution. The idea that you could make lots of money through making a better widget, that it could break down the barriers between levels in society, unleashed capitalism. It happened in England, it happened in Europe, it happened in the United States. In this story, as it unravels, the next thing that came was constitutional liberalism, which meant that you could acquire property because you made a better widget, and you had a right on that property, whether it's land or buildings or assets, and later on intellectual property. And so laws came into place, and society developed with some people who could make lots of money, some people could have laws. And democracy, which I'm defining as full franchise democracy, came last. And I tried to collect the data. Now, whether my definition of democracy is correct or not, I don't want to get into an intellectual debate. You have to choose some simple stuff, otherwise we'll have a thesis here. India gave full franchise democracy in 1947. And by the way, I think they did the right thing. That's a personal opinion. Norway gave them the vote in 1913, the UK in 1928, France in 1944, Italy in 1945, and then came India. Greece, Switzerland gave its women a vote in 1971, when I was quite grown up. And it's shocking. In the University of Cambridge in England, a woman could not borrow a library book till 1948. 1948, 1 year after India's independence, a girl could not borrow a library book. The reason I'm mentioning these oddities is there are lots of little Benjamins amongst the buttons. And it's good to sort of recount it, to say, if you think of everything as strange and difficult to decode, then it will stay so. India, in 1947, was coming after, 800, 900, 1,000 years of some form of occupation, if I may say so. And it decided, rightly, I think, that everybody shall have a vote. So we had democracy first, and we had no capitalism. We didn't know what's capitalism in 1947. Right up until 1991, there was no capitalism. When I began my career, if a magazine wanted to put you on the cover page, you ran in the opposite direction, because that magazine would be subscribed to you by the Department of the Income Tax, who would promptly get after you. And who the hell wanted that? It's only after 1991 that you find businessmen whose pictures come in the front page of a newspaper, and some of them like it, so they promote it. But many of them even now prefer not to do that. And my formula is, avoid the front page of newspapers, because that's a death knell. Your business seems to go sliding down right after that. Just like if some American business magazine says you're one of the world's successful corporations, you're sure you're going to be finished after that. That's an unfortunate, I don't know how the correlation works. So, I want to say that if you're used to seeing a horse drawing a cart, India is the only country in the world where the cart is drawing the horse. Not literally, but to say that the sequence is changed. There are countries, you could argue, Israel, South Africa, which are somewhat like India. So I won't get into a very fine discussion on that point. When I use the word only country, I'm taking the liberty of some puffery and some hyperbole to make my point. It's amongst the very few. So when you look at this society operating, it's come after whatever number of years of its history and has become a democracy first, and then later on is putting into place its constitutional liberalism. People talk about IPR, pharma industry. For God's sake, grow up. Grow up. I'm not saying they're right, I'm not saying they're wrong, I'm not talking about the pharma industry, it's not my specialty. But it's, you've got to see the sequence in which things are happening. And we still don't understand capitalism. And capitalism in itself doesn't understand itself, as you probably can recognize from their development in many societies. In the 5,000 years of recorded history that we have of India, India has been united in approximately the current shape that we have for only about 700 years. For 4,200 years, it's been a number of principalities, quite independent of each other, or reasonably independent of each other. I think approximately during Chandragupta's time, for those who are interested in history, you can go back and see when that was, about the time Alexander was coming here. Then I think there was a Gupta period, there was a bit in the Mughal period, and a little bit in the British period. Some flawed historians think that Britain united India, which is the biggest load of rubbish. I like to give them credit for many of the things they did. Because when Britain left India, more than 50% of the geography of India was under independent princely states. And it's some other genius, which is not the subject of my discussion today, which really united India. There was a frail-looking Gujarati man in a dhoti called Vallabhbhai Patel, who actually united India. Why am I mentioning this? Why is it relevant to know that there is an Indianness without there being an India? When people talk about a 5,000 year, they're talking of an idea. They're talking of a civilization. But there was no India. Even when passports start to get issued, you had a passport of the Nizam state, you had a passport of the Maharaja of Jaipur, you don't have a passport of India. So the fact that Indianness is there for 5,000 years without an India being there is something that's highly material for people to understand. Whereas if you look at many European histories, you'll say 400 years ago, 300 years ago, territory, and then they had their wars and so on and so forth. So I think it's very important to understand the political context in which India is trying to struggle with its politics. It's like Benjamin Button. It chose a very, very advanced and sophisticated idea of democracy without all the structures to be able to handle it. It's like choosing higher math when you're 10 years old without your being a genius. So that's as far as the political evolution is concerned. The second aspect I would like to touch upon is the economic evolution. Here again, the point is simple. It's been commented upon by academics and economists for a long time, that everybody went through this classical 4 or 5 stages of economic development: agriculture, followed by light industry, followed by infrastructure, followed by heavy industry, followed by services. But India is like a snakes and ladders, as we call it. You just jump from one place to the other place. So we don't have a great heavy industry or an infrastructure, but we have a very flourishing services industry. If you look at the consumption as a contribution to the GDP of India, India ranks with America, Switzerland, Europe, and even China comes well below, and there are others in between. In one respect, it does look like a highly developed country. And that is again part of the reason why it's... So in economic development also, it's got a Benjamin Button look. That it's one of the very few countries, again I would hesitate to insist it's the only one, which has jumped the sequence in its evolution. And then I want to talk about its cultural evolution, because if Indianness was an idea, but not India as an entity, what kept all this together? I respect other people's views, and some people think that there's no logical reason for Punjab to be with Tamil Nadu. And I don't want to get into that discussion. I just want to respectfully disagree with that. But the idea that there are customs which are religious, social, which are in the beliefs of people, and that's what makes a society, which are common across these. That Shankaracharya could leave Kaladi in Kerala and walk all the way to the north, south, east. It's quite a journey. It was tougher for me to come in a train from New York to here because of the snow. It's somehow captivating to me. And there are cultural factors. There are connections with the languages. Linguistics is not my subject. But I've been very struck that although we have 25 official languages, we got 2 classes of languages. Those that hang from the horizontal line and those that are above the horizontal line. It's pretty simple. All 4 South Indian languages sit above the line, like English. And all the North Indian languages hang from the horizontal line. And I don't use the word hang to be pejorative about it, but they do hang. And they all come from a common mother language, which also hangs from the line. And there is therefore this commonness with the diversity. And that influences a lot of the cultural factors. If you look at the evolution of philosophies and cultures of societies, the European culture, I would argue even the Anglo-Saxon culture and therefore the American culture, is born out of the Greek tradition of philosophy, which emphasized rationality, logic, trying to remove ambiguity. Ambiguity was a bad thing in Greek philosophy. You had to sort them out and have right and wrong and a thin line in between. Nothing wrong with it. Great tradition. But Eastern philosophies, and I will keep to India rather than I go to other countries, work on exactly the opposite. The principle is the world is all ambiguous. There's a thin sliver of clarity on either side. Everything else is ambiguous. Everything else is open. That's the philosophical tradition which has influenced the way we think. So, Indians are very comfortable with ambiguity until they come to the United States and then they get sorted out. But Indians in India are very... it could be this, it could be that. I'll meet you. I remember when I used to be the chairman of our company in Saudi Arabia, I was very particular that our expatriates should be able to settle down well. And there was a Swedish colleague who would often say, the one thing that drives me mad is when an Indian invites me home for dinner. So I said, I always thought you can't fathom the soap market or the shampoo market. He says, no, when an Indian invites me for dinner. I said, why? He said, in Sweden, they will say which date, which time, and I will go there 1 minute before 7 o'clock, and the dinner time would typically be 6:30, 7. And I would go the day before, drive around the block, and at 1 minute to 7, I'll ring the bell. He said, the Indian tells you to drop in for dinner. I said, but when? He says, what about Friday? As an afterthought. I said, okay, but at what time? 8-ish. He says, what is 8-ish? Is it 8:15? So he says, I'd go at 8:30 to be safe. And he's in the shower. And at 9:45, which is well past the guy's dinner time, and the Swede is dying of starvation, he's been pumped up with more alcohol than he's ever had before, comes somebody who's considered a VIP. He's a minister. He's a secretary to the government. He says, how do they work? So I said, well, that's the attitude to time. I'm not making a virtue out of it. I'm not making a vice out of it. I'm making a joke out of it. To say that these are deeply embedded. So I've seen, there's an IAS officer sitting here right in front of me. In their younger days, they serve as district magistrate, and we used to go and meet them where we ran our factories. Very common. What time shall I come tomorrow? You come tomorrow, 10 baje aa jaiye, 10:01. Whatever that means. So you turn up at 10 o'clock with your new watch from Harvard Business School, and there are 7 other people there in front of him. And the Indian IAS officer is remarkable. He can carry on 8 simultaneous conversations without a CDMA network. Aapka kya problem hai? And he will carry on. He'll be discussing when did your wife divorce you and when did you murder your son. And he's dealing with all 8 conversations, and you're waiting in between saying, my factory hasn't got his permit for whatever. He does solve problems, by the way. Otherwise, our districts won't work. This ability, cultural ability to multitask is bewildering, maddening, and crazy, all rolled into one. But it's a part of that cultural tradition that they have. You look at music, classical music. In a Western classical music ensemble, there'll be a conductor. He's doing funny things like, moving his little... And there must be 100 guys sitting there, each one with different instruments or clusters of instruments. All of them have a score sheet in front of them. He's highly disciplined, highly articulated, and one guy out of tune can screw up the whole show, the orchestra. And the admiration lies in the discipline of execution with a symphony. You come to an Indian classical music, there'll be only 4 or 5 people. You will not have 100 people. I'm not talking of Bollywood music, I'm talking of serious stuff. There'll only be 4 or 5 people. Nobody will have a score sheet. Nobody looking at a piece of paper. Each virtuoso will get his chance under the sun. And they will be competing with each other with a playfulness in their eyes, which you just can't understand from a Western music point of view. This is another aspect, another manifestation of this. And the last manifestation I want to suggest is in cuisine. I happen to be a vegetarian, and when I go out into the West, I ask, they take all their vegetables, they mash it up, and then they re-extrude it into a cutlet or a Pringles or whatever they do. In India, you ask for a vegetable curry. Each vegetable will be easy to identify. It's a separate piece of existence. And they're all held together by some sauce. Okay, so there's Matar Paneer, which is very famous for those who are from that part of the country. There's Avial if you're from another part of the country. But every vegetable has its own life, its own identity. And so when we talk of cultural harmony, it does not mean subsuming your culture into the other one, but it means learning to live with another culture with only a sauce connecting you. You don't find this anywhere. I ask a 3rd generation Italian in America, he's long forgotten Italian. That will happen to the 3rd generation Indian also. I'm not making a virtue out of it. But Indian society is very funny. People think India has 1.2 billion people in the population. Wrong. We have 4,000 communities of 300,000 each. I don't know if you realize how many communities we have. There are only 250,000 people who belong to my community. Because we break up our communities hierarchically into so many pieces. Again, I'm not making a virtue out of it. And the reason why the communities matter is because social interaction works on the community. You may say caste is bad, this is bad, but there's a reality there. So, if you leave out urban families like myself, or if you go back to my grandmother's time, you married within that subset. That doesn't happen here. And so America is also very diverse. But the nature of diversity and yet cultural unity in India is just mind-blowing. And that has a dynamic, which I shall touch upon. I think I should shut up in about 5-7 minutes, 10 minutes, and then you can have questions, right? Sorry, I got carried away trying to tell you how different we are. I don't know how many of you know that there are the community of Siddhis in Gujarat and Karnataka. They are absolute Africans. I use the word absolute to mean they came from Africa. We don't know exactly when, but somewhere around 1,000 or 1,100. They look like Africans. Their dances are African. They all speak Gujarati. You just come and say, wow, what did I see? You see the Parsis? They came in 800 AD or whatever, 1000 AD. And the story goes that when they landed on the coast of Gujarat, they went to the king and said, he said, who are you strange looking people with white robes? He said, we got chased out of our country because of whatever. And we want to settle here. He said, no, you'll mix with my people and it'll all cause confusion. They said, we promise you, the story goes, that we will stay separately and yet we will integrate, whatever that meant. And when the king said, I can't understand it, they asked for a cup of milk and a spoon of sugar. And they put the sugar in, dissolved it. They said, you see, the milk is still milk, but you can taste that it is sweet. We will sweeten your society without actually influencing it. And by God, they've done it for 1,000 years. They kept separate, and yet they are integrated. Not only that, they've made great contributions to the nation. I would like to close with just one example of, I've got many, but I won't go into that. I think it's better to have a little discussion of one more aspect of uniqueness in which this manifests itself. Foreigners come to India, they meet people in Delhi, in the Ministry of Finance, in the Planning Commission and various other think tanks where there are lots of thinking people, and they get one of the finest articulations of India's opportunities and problems. Indeed, you've had it for the last 2 days. But you go and see what's happening on the ground and you say, my God, why can't so many smart guys make it happen? And the reason is, according to me, Indians are the only community in the world who think in English but act in Indian. I'm not making a virtue out of it, but I don't think you should dismiss it because it's a reality. A Japanese thinks in Japanese, so he would, aso. And then he will try to convert it. The Chinese will do the same, the Korean will do the same. The Frenchman will definitely do the same. But the Indian will talk to you with perfect fluency, absolute clarity of thought, all, like Harvard Business School standard. But when he has to get to implement it in Indian society, so in a company, it happens, you think that, merit is the only reason why people should progress. No doubt about it. He can have a seminar on the subject and give a very fine speech. But when he goes back to his desk the next day, and you say, here's a man who's 52, here's a man who's 45, he say, well, everything looks equal, why not give the 52-year-old guy a chance? After all, he's a bit older. Why not check with the boss? I won't go into all the other examples. I think I want to sort of test myself whether such a tired audience as yourself can be kept interested. I think I've succeeded so far. At least I've said things that nobody else has said. And if you disagree with me, I will respectfully listen to your disagreement.
We're now open for questions. Just one request, please keep them crisp.
I read a quote like a few months back on Twitter that stayed with me, and that said that for India to change, Indians need to change. And our previous two keynotes talked a lot about the new change that is being promised in India. What are your views about the change that Indians need to do?
You know, everybody talks about the economic change, economic policy, political policy. I really think the change in India is a slower process. I'm very realistic. Yes, all that will happen, what Sajjan said this morning, what Adil said. But the real churn that's happening in India, the real heat under the bonnet, the real 93 octane fuel is the social change that's happening. That's not going to happen in 5 years. It's a generational change. But it's a very dramatic change that's happening. It's unbelievably exciting. I'm old enough now to think back about my childhood, my college days, and now I'm seeing my children, my grandchildren growing up. It's a fantastic feeling. I can see the change. But as Grigor Yavlinsky said in Russia, when people said in 1991, after the Berlin Wall episode, they said, Mr. Yavlinsky was the economy minister. You said you're making all this reform and change. When will we see action on the ground? He said, you know, you can put 9 pregnant women into a room, but the baby won't come out in 1 month. And that's the challenge we have.
More questions? Come on, guys.
Can you describe India and its place in the world in 2047?
That's easy. I won't be around, so I can tell you. It's really an easy question. Want to make it tougher? No, jokes aside. You know, I happen to have written a book which is about the generational change in India. I've traced through the eyes of my family, because that's the only story I could get hold of, what's happened since 1823. Not about my family, but what they saw. And it has proven to me, assuming it required proving, that it is so dramatic that the India of 2047 will be vastly different from anything that we can even imagine today. Now, I don't want to go into GDP and GNP and so on. Oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you one thing. Since everybody talked of GDP, I've made a speech about India without even referring to GDP, and such heresy cannot be allowed. I just want to say this. When people talk about growth, will you exceed China? China has been bigger than India, for, centuries. So what the hell is the hurry? You have to develop your country. That's your job. From 1847 till 1950, approximately British period, I'm not blaming the British, by the way, the per capita, because at the end of the day, it's per capita GDP. It's not the GDP that matters. Our population was happily galloping because we were producing babies, make in India, long before Narendra Modi said it. Was under 1%. It is some decimal place. It doesn't matter whether it's 0.4 or 0.3 or point. From time of independence to 1980 I chosen because that was about the time Mrs. Gandhi for the first time said, the socialism doesn't work. How can we do something about it? Although people attribute it to 1991, it began actually in Mrs. Gandhi's time. It was cut short and derailed by her assassination. But between 1950 and 1980, it was 1.3%. Much better than the British days or the colonial days, but still 1.3 per capita, which is what led Krishna to say that the Hindu rate of growth and so on. Now look at the dramatic change, how dramatic it is. So when you talk of 2047, in the decade from 81 to 91, it grew at 3.1% per capita GDP. I'm not talking about GDP. In the next decade from 92 to 2001, it's 4.1%. From 2001 to 2011, it grew at 6%. And from 2011 to 2047, you put a number 7.1, the horse is galloping. What are we looking around and calculating numbers? You don't need economists for this. It's helpful to have a few of them. But for God's sake, the horse is galloping. It's there. The population growth rate is coming down. The GDP is growing. The economy is diversifying. It's the world's biggest opportunity. So in 2047, it will be a fantastic place. And it's my great regret that I won't be around.
So I would like to know what would be a dream for my generation, what you see us doing, which not the previous generation today.
Well, I say take it your generation is like my son, who's also... I can only give micro examples, because I don't want to get macro. I don't want to be nationalistic or jingoistic about it. But every guy has got to balance in his life. What he wants is a trade-off between pleasure and purpose. Purpose is your purpose in life. What do you want to do? You want to do startup, you want to do this, you want to do e-startup, you want to do cabs, you want to start up a factory. So that's your purpose. Maqsad kya hai? And pleasure is gratification. And each of us makes a choice. None of them is wrong. So my dream is that each of people in your generation should make your choice between pleasure and purpose. But what I am seeing a lot of, and I don't have statistics to support it, except my family, my nephews, my children, they all came back. None of them is daunted by the fact that all the problems of India are there. I mean, that's not a subject to be, you can't hide it under a carpet, you don't need to. It's fantastic. But there are the procrastinators who say, well, not quite now, another 10 years, and then it goes on. They are not bad people. They are not taking the wrong decision. But if you think you've taken the wrong decision, you're sitting at the age of 55 saying, oh God, I'm stuck here, then that's your problem. But I think never in my many years have I seen such a pulsating set of opportunities. But you must have the courage. You must have the purpose to grab it. You can see a bed of roses, but there are thorns with it. You want the roses without the thorns. Nobody's serving it to you on a platter. It's an absolutely fantastic time, and particularly this window. For the first time, you have a prime minister who's a chief executive, who's an operating manager. He has been the chief minister of a state, as Sajjan Jindal was saying this morning. We've never had a prime minister who's been an operating manager. We've had HR chief, IT chief, finance chief becoming chief executive, barring Narasimha Rao, who had for a short time been. So it's a big thing. He knows what you're talking about. Second, since 1984, we haven't had a guy with a majority. And he's got an agenda. He's got a bunch of his own problems. But who's going to give you the big job without its own bunch of problems? So I can see, forget about 2047, by 2025, 10 years, such a dramatic change. And I hope to be alive, God willing, to see that. And I would be very sorry if I'm wrong. I think we'll never get a chance like this. Nothing to do with BJP, RSS, Congress, nothing of those. It is just what's happening out there.
Sir, how do you think over the years of liberalization and consumerization, our value system, people's individual values, morals, ethics have changed? And are they really providing a good foundation for us to get to the next level? What I'm thinking in the back of my mind is if I look outside of IT and some pockets, Bangalore, Hyderabad, the work ethics are not there. The productivity is not there, but the rates are going up. So things like those.
Rates are going up.
Like, the pace, salaries are going up. Like here, if I ask somebody to do something, they'll charge a good amount of money, but they'll do it. There you have to constantly sit on top of people and get things done. And that going to other things, just in general value system and ethics, how have that changed and are we ready? Because that took the foundation to check this.
I think I understand the structure of your question. If you ask me how's your company doing, I can say, well, in the 50s and 60s it grew at 8%, then it became 6%, and now it's growing at 3%. You can say, oh, you're a lousy company. The second way, I can look at your market share and say, oh, that whole industry, that segment has ceased to grow, but my market share is still 56% or whatever it was back in the 50s. So it depends on how you look at it. I think, without for a moment rejecting any of the points that you have made, I think India is changing at a pace which is, I don't know what else to call it, but stunning. You know, if you look at corruption, it's there. But our market share in corruption is not different. You look at Benjamin Button, you look at India today, and people compare it with other countries. I think it's an absolutely right comparison. You should. But a 25-year-old capitalist economy, I look back, I've researched this, I've written a little paper on it. I looked at how America was in 25 years of capitalism. How was Britain at 25 years of capitalism? They were venal. They still are venal, by the way, in their politics, I mean. But the nature of the work and corruption was always there. Unfortunately, that is not, while that may be true, it is not a justification for India, and therefore it should never be complacent and say, that's okay, I'll be all right, fine. But I'm answering your question. I can see the glass is half full or half empty. I'm perhaps very charged up with the other part. I have my frustrations, I have to say, when I think like you, what you just asked.
My father-in-law, my ex-father-in-law, thankfully, observed on his first visit to the US that he was pretty high up in the banking sector, where they were trying to get identities for farmers and so forth. So he made an observation that the conformance level in the US of an average citizen is much more than the conformance level of an Indian citizen. People don't conform to laws and so forth. Do you think that's the truth?
If your father-in-law said it, he must be right. I can't say I disagree, he can't even defend himself. And from the tone of your question, you're not going to defend him either.
In the next 20 years, you see India growing a lot. How do you think India can balance its growth with the environment? What do you think India needs? What steps do you think the country or the government or private sector needs to make in order to make sure that we grow without, harming our environment?
The growing part I don't have to cover because I think a lot of people have talked about it. This point about harming the environment depends on whose definition of harm you're taking. If you think of an escalator, India has people at that end of the escalator and also at this end of the escalator, somewhere middle. We got a very, very wide range. And the view of the guy at the top of the escalator is very different from the view of the guy at the bottom. It's very clear to me, I think it's said in one of the panels this morning, that Indian industry has a fantastic opportunity to develop itself differently from the way industry developed elsewhere. And many people gave examples of what they are doing in their cement factory or their steel factory or whatever. But you have to put some chips on the table. You have to damage some part of the environment. Your rate of damage may be lower than what somebody else did. I think the awareness of environment in India is very high. Is it high enough? It could be better. And the balance of it is not at all easy. But I think society is finding a way to do it.
Last question.
Perhaps India once had a woman prime minister, and I was wondering, my question is, what can we do as youth today that women will feel comfortable in India getting on a bus at night and at least one day having enough power and belief in themselves that they can become prime minister?
Actually, it's a very a good question. I have a view. Since you asked me the question, I have the privilege of giving you my view. In the last 2 days, nobody's talked about agriculture. Who cares? It's 15% of the GDP. Okay? Probably a tad less than industry, maybe it's 12%. And nobody cares. So many people are talking about IT and cabs and this and that. But there's a real world out there. There are real people. Now, what's happening in India is that development means everybody moves to the cities. You can't afford to even take yourself to the city, forget about your wife and so on. So you find a lot of desperate characters. And I say desperate not in pejorative terms. I really empathize. Living in conditions which have been talked about, slums and so on. I think making rural India urban, it sounds like a very tangential solution to the problem. And keeping people interested in being in that, you can't have 1.2 billion or what, 1.6 billion people living in clumps, which is the way you're headed. And there's a fantastic, if you look at the urbanization trends in Tamil Nadu, which is my state, villages are becoming towns without people going to the city. Chennai is crowded, but nothing like some of the other cities. So what is really happening is development, connection of roads. I can't say Tamil Nadu is a perfect place, but Tamil Nadu and Gujarat lead this country in urbanization. I think Tamil Nadu is close to 40 to 43%, and Gujarat is probably a tad less. And all the economic studies show that when urbanization crosses 50, you take off. And that's happening to consumption in these two states. It is not happening in certain other parts. And I would hope that as the economy grows and we can get rid of this east of Kanpur syndrome, this aspect of economic development will in part address that. I don't think it's right to say all Indian men are venal, all Indian women are crazy. These are all sort of very general statements. There is a root cause behind it, and it's a human problem. It's a thing that should get up. But then if it happens, it's terrible for the family and the woman concerned. I agree with you.
Great. Thank you so much, sir.